All right, welcome back. In this video, I want to discuss the basic divisions of the human nervous system and then pay special attention to the brain and some major structures within the brain. So on this flow chart, we have a basic division of the overall nervous system. And the first distinction to be made is that between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is our brain and spinal cord. Essentially, this is our decision maker. It's the computer, if you will. It takes all the information and it decides what to do with it. So I guess one question would be, where does the brain and spinal cord get the information that it works with? And that's primarily the peripheral nervous system, which is essentially a network of neurons coursing through every part of our body. So for example, we have nerves that connect all of our muscle tissue, all of our organs, you name it. The peripheral nervous system is all over the body. And the peripheral nervous system has a number of subdivisions. And so next we have the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And just like you see there, the somatic nervous system is voluntary and the autonomic is involuntary. So for example, imagine you are sitting in class and you raise your hand in order to ask a question. Because you wanted to do that action, you can bet that the somatic nervous system was involved. In other words, the neurons that you are using to control your arm movement in terms of voluntary action, we call that the somatic nervous system. On the other hand, there are a number of actions that are involuntary. And first and foremost, an easy way to remember this is the name autonomic. It looks very similar to the word automatic. And so think about breathing, for example, or heartbeat. These are human behaviors that we do not have to think about at a conscious level. And fortunately, because if we had to pay attention to every single time we wanted to beat our heart, we would probably have a hard time paying attention to other much more important things in our environment. So the autonomic nervous system is all about involuntary subconscious processing. And that actually has one final division within it, and that is the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is more commonly known as the body's fight or flight network. And this is the body of nerves through our body that essentially prepares us for a threat. So imagine you are a zebra and you're foraging the plains of Africa, you're looking for food, and then all of a sudden you look up and a few 100 feet away, you see a lion and it starts to run at you really, really fast. Obviously, you need to avoid that lion so that you live. So this would be a threatening situation, and your brain would say, okay, sympathetic nervous system, it's time to increase activity. We need to survive. So the fight or flight system, it increases activity in terms of increased heartbeat, increased blood pressure. It causes our pupils to dilate so that we can see really well. And basically, it's anything you might need in order to fight or run away really fast. So a zebra is probably not going to fight a lion. So in this case, the sympathetic nervous system is going to increase blood pressure and heartbeat so that it gets oxygen and blood to its legs so it can run away really fast. And so let's suppose that the zebra survives. The zebra escapes, the threat is gone. At that point, the parasympathetic nervous system is going to increase activity. And the nickname for this network is the rest and digest network. So essentially, this is a body of neurons that controls things like stomach digestion, for example. And digesting food takes energy. So if you're in a threatening situation, in other words, if your life is at stake, you don't want to waste any energy doing something that isn't necessary. In other words, if you're not going to be alive in 5 or 10 minutes, it would be a complete waste of energy to be digesting your food. So if you're in a threatening situation, the sympathetic nervous system wants all of that extra energy to help you run away or help you fight. But essentially, this is a balanced situation. So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, they keep us in balance, and they're activated all the time. So for example, right now, my sympathetic nervous system is activated. It's helping me speak. It's helping me sit upright. It's helping me move my arms. And when this video is over, I can rest a little more, at which point the parasympathetic nervous system is going to increase activity to help me calm down and help digest my lunch. All right, so let's pay a little more attention to the central nervous system, because psychology is the study of human thought and behavior, and we tend to focus on thoughts and behaviors that are regulated by the brain. So here we have a basic cross-section of the brain, thanks to Google. And what I want to point out here are 3 primary structures of the brain, just an overall glance at our brain. So first and foremost, at the base of our brain is the brain stem. This is the part of our brain where our spinal cord fuses up into our head. And there are a number of structures within the brainstem, but generally speaking, think of the brainstem as responsible for basic life functions. So for example, breathing and heartbeat. These are actions that we don't have to think about at a conscious level, and that's what the brainstem is all about. It's about keeping us alive, allowing the other parts of the brain to focus on higher level functions. But let's focus on one area in particular. This structure back here is called the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is part of the brainstem that primarily regulates our balance and coordination. So again, you don't have to think about balance. When you walk, it is a subconscious activity. You've been doing it for years and years and years. That is something that is regulated at a lower level in the brain. Interestingly, this part of the brain gets significantly heavier from the time we're born until, for example, age 2. So if we think about the first 2 years of life, we come into the world, we are very uncoordinated, we can't walk, we can barely control our arms. But by age 2, children are running, skipping, jumping, and so all of that balance and coordination is actually nicely reflected by a significant increase in the weight of that part of the brain. So overall, the brainstem is basic life functions. Next, covering the brainstem is the limbic system. And so imagine this pen is the brainstem. Covering the pen or the brainstem is our limbic system. So deep in the center of our brain, the limbic system primarily regulates our emotional life. So basic emotions and drives. So things like aggressive behavior, things like fear, things like sleep, things like sex. These basic emotions and drives are all regulated by our limbic system. And I want to point out just one structure in particular. This strip of brain tissue right here is the corpus callosum. And so why is this important? Well, as we're going to touch upon in a moment, we have 2 hemispheres, 2 sides of the brain known as hemispheres. And they are connected primarily through the corpus callosum. So it's the primary connector between our 2 hemispheres. Okay, and so last but not least, we have the cerebral cortex, or the cerebellum. This is the most outer layer of the brain. It's the part of the brain that we probably think about most when we picture a brain. It's the outer layer, the wrinkly, most outer part of the brain. And the word cortex actually means bark in Latin. So if you think about like the bark on a tree, it's the outer layer of the tree. The outer layer of our brain is the cortex. And so that is, in general, responsible for executive functioning. So think of the cortex as like the boss, the CEO of our brain. It controls all higher level functions like decision making, language, and communication, things like that. And because it's so important, we're actually going to focus on it in a little more detail right here on this slide. And what we're talking about here are the 4 lobes of the cerebral hemisphere, or the cerebral cortex. So again, as mentioned, we have 2 sides of our brain, the left side and the right side, and each of those hemispheres can be subdivided into 4 primary hemispheres. Now, these hemispheres, or these lobes, have a number of responsibilities, but what I want to highlight are just some of the primary functions of each. All right, so actually let's go back. Let's focus one at a time. On the sides of our head, near the temples and the ears, is the temporal lobes. So easy to remember, the temporal lobe, it's near the temples, it's also right near the ears, and the primary responsibility here is auditory information, among other things like memory integration, but primarily researchers, think about the primary function as auditory information. Second, we have the occipital lobe. And what's kind of interesting here is that the eyes are in the front of our head, yet the part of our brain that is responsible for visual processing is in the back of our head, and that's the occipital lobe. Third, we have the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is, it's labeled in yellow on the slide, and it's in the back sides of our head. Think of this as responsible for logic and abstraction, but also other sensory information, so touch, taste, and temperature. And now last, but certainly not least, is the frontal lobe. And if the cortex in general is the executive, well, think of this as the boss of the boss. The frontal lobe is responsible for planning and decision making, judgment, thinking about the future. And what's fascinating about this is that it's the very last part of our brain to mature. On average, it takes about 25 years of life for the frontal lobe to fully mature. And so personally, I think that opens up a bunch of really interesting questions. And so one that I tend to think about is it right to prosecute a criminal as an adult after the age of 18, even though according to biology, we still have a number of years of developing in terms of judgment and decision making. So an 18-year-old arguably might have 7 more years of life until where their brain is actually mature enough to make really well thought out decisions. But this part of the brain in particular needs a slightly, just one additional point to be made, which is in the very front of the frontal lobe is the prefrontal cortex. And this is the part of the brain that really separates us from all of the other animals. It's this part of the brain that has evolved over millions of years to allow us to make the types of decisions that we do, to plan for the future in the way that no other animal does. And so importantly, there's an interesting relationship when it comes to brain size and intelligence. So it turns out that just having a big brain is not enough. So for example, elephants have really large brains, but obviously we are much more intelligent than an elephant. But what we have is a giant prefrontal cortex. The ratio of that part of the brain relative to the rest of our brain it's gigantic. And so when it comes to the question, does size matter? It does if you are talking about the prefrontal cortex. Ours is much larger, relatively speaking, relative to the rest of our brain compared to any other mammal out there. And so that is why we have the ability to have the intelligence that we have, to communicate and to plan the way that no other animal can. And so, here we are, we're discussing these ideas over the internet through machines that humans created. The intelligence of humans is mind-boggling, and arguably it's that prefrontal cortex that evolved over millions of years that brought us to where we are today.